Hi, everybody. Welcome to tonight's live stream class with City Market on Savory Buckwheat Crepes. My name is Carrie. I am City Market's Assistant Outreach and Education Manager. I'm the one who's been sending all of the emails. I'm sorry that I can't see all of your faces to meet you in person as well, but someday we'll get back to those. I'm really excited for tonight's class with our instructor, Anna Mays. I will only be on screen for right now, and then I'll be behind the scenes kind of working on all the tech stuff. If at any point during tonight's class you have questions for Anna or for me, you can type them into the question and answer box. I'll go back and put an announcement into that so you can see where that is and how to view that. I will see those and I can pass them along to our instructor, or I can answer them privately as well if they're just a question that I can answer on my end. If you're joining us a little bit late, you can always hit live. It's down near the play pause button. That will catch you up to where we are rather than making you watch from the very beginning. And I think that's it for me. If there's any point like sound issues or video issues, just type something in that question and answer box and I'll see it and try to fix it, but we should be good. Without further ado, I think I will turn things over to our instructor, Anna, and let her take it away. All you.
Great. Thank you, Carrie. Good evening, everyone. My name is Anna, and I am really excited to be teaching you galette tonight. This is going to be a class on savory buckwheat crepes, which in France are known as galettes. And this is just a really exciting class for me because I feel like here in Vermont, we've just sort of transitioned into the winter, colder months, darker months of the year. And buckwheat, to me, has this really earthy, kind of robust, really well with sort of winter vegetables. And I think of it as a really nice sort of hearty meal for this time of the year. So when I was putting together the menu for this class, I was trying to think what would be some sort of fun variations on the typical fillings for buckwheat crepes. So tonight we're going to be doing a pretty ambitious program. I'm going to teach you the technique for making the crepes and then go on to some standard fillings. We're going to talk about the cheeses that are used and the galettes complètes, which is with ham and egg. And then we're going to move to some of the more sort of wintry seasonal fillings, which are going to be looking at a squash puree, a roasted butternut squash puree, and then we're going to make a wild mushroom and kale ragu to top it off. And then sort of our final step is going to be looking at how to make a really nice kind of fresh herb vinaigrette, which then goes with a salad, which is often served beside the crepe. So that's our program for tonight. Before we dive in, I just wanted to say a few words about my background. My training is originally as a cultural anthropologist, and I really believe in sort of grounding the recipes that we learn in the regions that they've emerged from and kind of giving some recognition and credit to the history of the recipes and the culture that surrounds them. And I then went on to culinary school and studied at the Cordon Bleu, which is a sort of French style culinary skills. So this recipe I'm teaching you tonight is one that I was taught in culinary school and I think really works very well. It's very versatile and very easy to make. So I think you'll like it. I hope everybody probably has gotten the handout. Thank you, Carrie, for sending that out. I want to just take us for a moment back to 12th century France. So if you take a look at the last page, you have a map. Crepes originated in the northwestern region of France, known as Bretagne or Brittany. And it's a very interesting history because way back in the 12th century, is when buckwheat was first introduced to this region. This is a region with a lot of rain, so has the potential for good pasture and good grain growing, except that the soil is very acidic and rocky, and there's a lot of sort of hillsides. So wheat did not grow very easily in this region. And we believe it was during the Crusades that buckwheat was brought over from China, where it originated, or perhaps sort of Southeast Asia, and then brought by the Crusaders and sort of took root literally in this region of northwestern France and really thrived on this sort of rocky soil there. Buckwheat became the main crop, the main grain, and it was milled in a very sort of rustic, just not mechanized manner. So it was very sort of coarse at first. And we believe that the origin of buckwheat crepes is, in fact, as many culinary recipes, an accident, where the tradition goes, the story goes, there was a housewife making buckwheat porridge with the groats, the grain, in her home at the hearth, maybe nearby a large skillet, and she somehow sort of spilt over this porridge onto the hot rock of the skillet, and it sizzled and it actually got crispy and formed sort of this flatbread. And that, we think, was the original sort of pancake or crepe. So it was probably so tasty that then became a practice, because by the 13th century, we have records and documentation of buckwheat crepes being made in France. And they, after that, really just kind of spread out through the rest of France, southern France, and into Eastern Europe. There's a large tradition of using kasha or buckwheat in Eastern Europe and Russia. You've probably maybe encountered buckwheat as in a groat form in those cuisines. But nowadays we have buckwheat crepe really all over the world. You can find them in Montreal. I think here in Burlington, Skinny Pancake does not use buckwheat, but they do use the sort of wheat flour crepes. But buckwheat is a wonderful grain, and I really try to encourage folks to use it, especially for anyone who is trying to limit or avoid gluten. Buckwheat is a pseudo cereal, so although the name includes the word wheat, it is not at all in the wheat family. So there is no gluten in buckwheat. And it's not really a grass. It's like quinoa. It's a pseudo cereal. If you look at this flour, the buckwheat flour, you can see it sort of has these dark specks in it. And I actually wanted to bring you some buckwheat groats, but I didn't have any at home. But the groats are pretty large. They're much larger than sort of the wheat berry. And when it's milled, you get these sort of dark flecks. And sometimes it's referred to in French as blé noir, or sort of black wheat for that reason. But again, it's totally gluten-free, and it actually has a wonderful nutritional profile. It's one of the few grains that has all 9 amino acids. So it's a complete plant protein. It has a really high source of dietary fiber as well as magnesium. So it's all around a great grain in terms of just health as well as flavor. So if you haven't yet tried buckwheat, hopefully with this class you will. It's available in most supermarkets. Here at City Market, we carry it in the bulk department, and you can just get a little bit and try. I think Healthy Living carries it locally, but most large supermarkets have it at this point. So that's my little intro to buckwheat. So before we actually get started, I did want to say a word also about the equipment for crepe making. So there are lots of different ways to make crepe or galette. I should say that I may be switching between those two terms. I tended to use crepe in the description for this class because that's more widely known. But if you go to France, and especially Brittany, a buckwheat crepe isn't ever called a crepe. It's always called a galette. The original name was galette crepe, and they still are using just galette. So if you're, in a restaurant in Paris or Bretagne, you want to be asking for a galette. So to make galettes or these sort of flat pancakes, it's really helpful to have probably 3 pieces of equipment that are going to make all the difference for your cooking. Is the correct pan. Now you can make a crepe in any pan. It's just that to make sure that you have the correct, it's important to have the right ratio between whatever ladle or. Now, if you're eating out in a crêperie in France, you will have these more industrial sized crêpes, which are about 20 inches round. And those are made on these beautiful skillets that are made in Bretagne and cost about $3,000. I wanted one once for a long time, but they're a little expensive for the home kitchen. Otherwise, a great substitute are these blue steel pans made by De Bauer, which is a French company. I've included the info on your handout. And what's nice about these is that they are really non-stick. but without using any Teflon. I try to avoid cooking with high temperature on Teflon for health reasons. And I really like that you're able to get a very good nonstick surface on this and having the steel. So this is a pan that is 8 inches across. So if you're maybe looking through your kitchen pans currently that you have, look for something that's as close to maybe 8 inches across as possible, 9.5 at the outer rim. And for that size, the ladle size we want is 1/4 cup. That's about 60 milliliters or 2 ounces. And you can find a ladle. I find that it's worth getting a ladle as opposed to using a 1/4 cup because the cup, it's very easy for it to just fall into your batter, and then you'll be kind of reaching in for that handle, which will be submerged in the batter. So if you find a ladle that's about a 1/4 cup size, that's great. And then the final tool that's helpful to get and is often sold with a pan is this wooden spatula. It's long and thin and is able to get really underneath the crepe in a way that a traditional spatula that's wider doesn't, like a pancake spatula. So again, these are often sold as a set, but I find that especially if you're kind of getting into the business of crepe making at home on a regular basis, it's really helpful to have a designated crepe pan. They're not too expensive, about $25 or $30. Locally, we have them at Kiss the Cook sometimes, so you might want to call ahead on Church Street. They often carry them. So if you're cooking along with us, that was just a preview of what would be great to assemble. Otherwise, yeah.
We did bill this as not a cook along just because we have a lot of prep done ahead.
Yes, this is going to be kind of fast paced. So yeah, designed more as a demo than a cook along. But other options are cast iron usually works well, especially if it's very seasoned. And also I was going to show you, before I got crepe pans, I was using just a stainless steel pan. And this, depending on your stainless steel, may just need a little extra fat to prevent it from sticking, but it can, if it's pretty nonstick, will be able to work well without having your crepe stick too much. So, don't be hindered by having the correct pan. You can try using whatever. If you're using something larger than 8 inches, more like 10 or 12 inches, I would increase the size to maybe 1/3 or a half.
And real quick, while Anna's getting to the next step, I am hearing those few little sound blips. I'm not sure what's causing them, and I'm trying to do some troubleshooting on my end, but hopefully it's just going to be little blips here and there until I can figure that out. So sorry about that, and I will try to do something to make that stop.
Okay. Oh, ask questions as I'm going along. Feel free to just type them in, and Carrie will either ask. So the first step, and I say this for most of my classes, is to do your mise en place. That is the kind of French term for getting everything and putting it in its place. So collecting your ingredients, scaling them out, and having everything ready to go. It's much more efficient to bake or cook that way, as opposed to sort of running to the cabinet to get different things individually and weighing them out sort of as you go along. Something else I like to mention is that especially with baking or anything that we're using, a batter or a dough, it's really helpful to measure by weight rather than by volume. And for doing that, I like to use a kitchen scale. And I've actually scaled out my ingredients already, but that will just make your life a lot easier, especially if you're going to be doing, lots of baking or bulk batches. You can also, scale up or down your recipe a little bit more easily using the metric system by weight. So I've provided in your handout both the metric measurements as well as the cup measurements, the imperial measurements. So feel free to use whatever is more comfortable. And also it's a great chance to kind of get familiar with, how much is 200 grams of flour? That's about 1.5 cups. So just to kind of get those conversions down. So the first step in making the batter is to sift our flour into the bowl. And I've already scaled and sifted the buckwheat flour. I wish we could all be here.
We had someone who says that they flour their baking pans with buckwheat for easy cleanup.
Oh, what a great idea. I love that.
And then we also had somebody ask, in the recipe picture, the texture of the crepe looks like injera. Is it?
Oh, interesting.
Is it fermented, or
that's a great observation.
Bubbly?
So yes, so this does look like injera. And the bubbles in this case are coming more from, I think, the heat interacting with the egg in the batter and forming those bubbles, as opposed to a fermented dough like injera. As you'll see, this dough rests a little bit, but not long enough to really do much fermentation at all. And especially it's not yeasted, so it would take a much longer time to have a fermented dough. But I think, yeah, I think those come from sort of the texture of the buckwheat as well as the egg on the pan. And, you know, we're not trying to get maybe holes quite that big, I would say. Maybe the heat might have been a little high for that. But yeah, that could very well be injera. So I've sifted my flour and added it in. I'm going to, at this point, add my salt. And that's because it's really easy to fully combine your dry ingredients when everything is still dry. And I like to whisk the salt so it's fully incorporated into the flour. And the next step is to add our eggs. So I've cracked 4 eggs into this bowl, and I'm just going to whisk them first together. So we're going to add the eggs fully whisked. Now, if anyone's familiar with making crepe with wheat flour, you're going to notice that the ratio of liquid to flour is much higher with more liquid in this recipe. And that is because anyone who's familiar with buckwheat flour will know that's because it's a very thirsty flour. It's sort of a thick, coarse flour that takes a lot more liquid than a wheat flour to make the same consistency.
All right, hopefully the little adjustment that I made will stop the sound blips, but let me know if you're still hearing them. Sorry about that again.
Okay, so we're going to first bring the flour in a little bit from the sides and whisk together the eggs with a little bit of the flour. And then before it's fully combined, to help with the combination process, we're going to add our milk, little bits at a time. And if you saw that big glop of cream that came, that's a reminder. I wanted to give a plug for Stratford Creamery. Their milk here in Vermont is just wonderful. It's the one place you can go at a grocery store without going to a farm to purchase milk that has not been homogenized. And I really like their milk because that's the closest, you know, to how the milk is when it comes out of the cow. And it's really great because they have this cream-lined version where you get this much cream on top. So I usually give it a good shake first. But, you know, if you're making whipped cream, you can just skim off the cream and use that. But I try to use any milk or cream product that would be either low temp pasteurized or raw, if you can find it, and non-homogenized. So you probably noticed the recipe has a range for the amount of milk that we're going to pour in. And why would that be? That's because we do see a variation in the types of buckwheat flour. And sometimes a flour will produce the consistency that you want with lesser milk, and sometimes it's going to take a bit more milk. So as is often the case, I would say go by the final product that you're looking at rather than by the recipe. The recipe should serve as sort of an indication, but ultimately what you want to get used to is looking for a consistency of batter that is similar to a heavy cream. So that's what we're looking for. It's much thinner than a pancake batter, and it's actually going to thicken up even more once we let it sit. So I'm probably going to use all of this cream, or all of this milk.
Yeah, we have someone just saying thanks so much for hosting and for speaking. We had someone really excited to try an authentic galette.
Yay.
Someone commented that Skinny Pancake has made buckwheat crepes in the past as a gluten-free option.
Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
That's great to hear. So if you're gluten-free, maybe you could just ask and see if they'd have the buckwheat version.
And Karen would like to know if you can use non-dairy milk to make these.
Oh yes, thanks for asking that, Karen. Yeah, so crepes are very kind of versatile in terms of the liquid that you use. And back in the early times, those households who were kind of lower down in the economic status and maybe didn't have their own cows were actually making their galettes with water. And eggs and water. So you could use any number of things such as maybe almond milk or oat milk. You could just use water. You could use some of the like nut milks as well, like hazelnut. I bet that would be really good. But because the buckwheat is so strong in flavor, I'd say don't splurge for like a really fancy one because you may not, be tasting it as much. So I try it maybe with water first and see what the flavor is like, and then maybe try your go-to milk substitute. And you could also, along those lines, you could also use coconut butter instead of the butter. So it's pretty much combined, which means now I'm going to do the last step, which is adding the butter. And this is just going to take a moment to warm up. So those of you who've taken a class with me before may have heard me talk about how much the French love to brown their butter. And that is something that it comes into play with this recipe, as well as for the wheat crepes, which it really just makes such a difference. So there's a term in sort of the French culinary world, which is beurre noisette, which means a hazelnut butter. So we're basically going to be browning the butter to give it this sort of nutty flavor and bringing it down to a color that's almost as sort of dark and tan brown as hazelnuts. And there are actually technically 3 different levels of brown you can go to, and a French recipe will usually specify which one. But for this, you can just, play around with it and get it however brown you would like. This is also a trick that works really well for chocolate chip cookies. Browned butter will really make that sort of buttery flavor pop out of the cookie if you want to try. So I'm just going to warm this up. Are there any questions while we're waiting for the butter?
Not yet. I've asked all the ones that have come through so far.
Yeah, okay.
If people want to, also, we love knowing where people are watching from, since we have been made aware that we've reached a wider audience than just Burlington, Vermont. So if you feel like sharing, you can also type where you're watching from in the question and answer box, and we can share some of those.
Yeah. So while we're talking about butter, it's a good chance to mention what I like to use on the pan. So this is going to be for later when we're actually making the crepes. In French baking and cooking, we often are going to use a butter that has had the milk solids removed so that it doesn't burn. And this is basically something that we use to fry things in that will give us that high heat ability to fry without turning brown, but at the same time will still have that really rich buttery flavor. And in French cuisine, it's usually clarified butter, and you can make that at home pretty easily, or you can just purchase ghee. So ghee is pretty much synonymous. That's the Indian version of making clarified butter. And it's really great because I actually make my pancakes at home and waffles and French toast with ghee because it gives you just this really rich buttery flavor, and isn't as sort of oily as like a vegetable oil for making pancakes. And so if you want to try making it at home, I would start with maybe a good pound of butter, like a full packet of 4 sticks of butter, and you just heat it up until the milk fat is going to sort of come to the surface, and then you're going to skim off the fat, the milk solids, because that's what is actually burning and will sort of caramelize and then turn brown. But once you remove those, the rest of the fat that remains won't turn brown. It won't burn. So that's the clarified butter. And it's really easy to do at home, and it's much, I'd say, more affordable than buying it in the store.
And a lot of Vermont viewers right now, someone from Moortown, Vermont, Essex, another Essex. We had someone ask if vegan butter is okay, and I think you mentioned
Oh,
like,
yeah,
coconut
yeah,
butter
that's
or
a
the
good idea
soy
too.
butter.
Vegan butter would be great. Yep. You could use that.
I have no idea. Could you clarify vegan butter?
Ooh,
Because it's not a milk
that's
solid.
a
It's just a
good. Does vegan
solid
butter
fat.
burn? I'm not familiar with
To
how
experiment
it
with
performs. Yeah. So we're gonna let this get a little darker. If you want, you could also use your crepe pan for browning the butter. I tend not to do that because oftentimes the butter is going to kind of spill down the side when you pour it into the pan, into your bowl, and you may have a little, mess to clean up. But that is a way to maybe not dirty an extra pan.
Someone from Middlesex and someone from San Diego. Our
Wow,
first
that's
non-Vermont watcher. That's
That's
awesome.
great.
Welcome, everybody.
Well, yes, whoever's tuning in from San Diego, you may have a better variety of vegetables still available. This class was sort of planned with when I planned it a month or two ago, I was sort of thinking what would still be coming out of my garden that we could use or what might be in like cold storage for the vegetables to go with us. So I'm hoping those of you in Vermont might still have some kale or some butternut squash that's still kind of put away drying.
Smell the butter all of a sudden.
I know, it's great. So it's just starting to brown at the top. I'm gonna let it go a little bit more.
I wish we had smell cameras somehow.
I
like,
know,
we
that
can't
would be
have people.
so great. Yeah.
Brown butter is amazing.
It really makes all the difference. It's worth that extra little step. I'm curious, how many of you have actually made buckwheat crepes before? If you have, maybe type your name or type something into the chat.
Yeah, and if anybody takes what they learned from this class and goes and makes crepes, send me a picture and I will share them with Anna because we love seeing people make things from our classes together.
Yeah.
And one of these days, hopefully in the near future, we'll get back to in-person classes and everybody can come make crepes with us.
Yes,
eat them with us.
That will be the day. These classes, are fun because we can reach a wider audience virtually, but it's been really great when we can all just gather around the table and sample things and chit chat as we're cooking. Maybe in the new year. Okay.
Someone who's made buckwheat pancakes before.
Oh, great. Crepes. Okay. So so you're familiar then with that flavor in the pancakes. Yeah. Great. Okay. So you can see here how the top has turned slightly brown. And if we could share with you the smell, it really has this sort of nutty smell and flavor. So I'm just going to let that cool for a moment so that I don't scramble my eggs that are in there. The batter is pretty resilient because of the cold milk, but I never like to pour sort of sizzling butter onto anything with eggs.
Here's someone asking kind of the same question I had. Could you brown the coconut oil if you were using coconut oil? I'm not sure it would brown.
That's
a pure fat.
I feel like I've never cooked with coconut oil and seen it actually turn brown, but maybe if you take it long enough, it might. You could give that a try.
I think
and just
you could try it, but I worry that you're gonna reach its smoke point and just have burnt fat.
Might be like smoking. You could also Google it to see.
Yeah. Here's someone who says they'd often had these while in France. Can't wait to try making them. Karen says, we'll be teaching my granddaughter who couldn't come to the class, but she adores them and they're going to make them for Christmas.
Oh, wonderful. That's so great to hear. I have to say, this is when I was living in France after high school for a year before university. And when I discovered buckwheat crepes, it was like a life-changing culinary experience. There's just like nothing like that flavor of the crispy buckwheat with like a Gruyere cheese and then vegetables or cream. It's just so good. So if you haven't tried them yet, yes, definitely give them a try.
Yeah. And someone asked, are buckwheat crepes ever used for sweet crepes? And what would be a typical sweet filling? I've made buckwheat crepes before simply by trying to adjust my recipe. So would you ever use these for sweet or
Absolutely. And you know, while traditionally buckwheat is used more for the savory crepes and wheat flour is used for the sweet crepes, that is by no means a hard and fast rule. You could absolutely switch it up. I think that buckwheat and chocolate go really well together. I often do other desserts with buckwheat and chocolate. So you could try any of your fillings, but I would say especially anything with like chocolate and hazelnut, like a Nutella type spread. I would think like berries, so jams with berries would go really nicely with the buckwheat, as well as maybe something kind of straddling that more savory and sweet, like maybe mascarpone with like slightly sweetened with some fresh fruit. I think something that I have seen in France that's maybe more traditional is like baked apple with like a chèvre or a whipped cream in the buckwheat. So yeah, definitely play around with it. And especially for anyone who's gluten-free, it's a great way to be able to enjoy a sweet crepe, to just use the buckwheat batter for both savory and sweet. Yeah. All right, so I think this has cooled down enough to add.
Yeah, and as you're adding that, Karen asks, is it the milk sugar that browns? So I think it's the milk. It's solids and sugars.
It's the solids, which probably do contain the lactose in the milk. So yeah, that I would think that that makes sense. Yeah.
One of those great experiments.
It is. It really is. So you can see we've got sort of this really golden butter with the brown specks. And we're just going to whisk that in.
Karen suggested stone fruit as well. Yeah, summer.
Stone fruit, nice. Yeah, that would be great.
Someone says a now closed restaurant in Hilton Head specialized in buckwheat crepes, and they were awesome.
Ooh.
Got someone watching from Montpelier. Welcome. Berkeley, California. We got both coasts represented. We got the Californians, we got the Vermonters.
Oh, that's great. Great. Yeah, so at this stage, if you're in a rush, you could go ahead and pour your crepes into the pan and make them. However, the batter will perform best if it is given a slight rest. And that should be anything from at least 15 minutes to up to like 24 hours. So I'm going to give this to Carrie. We're going to cover it and then put it into the fridge, ideally overnight. So this is a great recipe to do, you know, start the day before you're planning to serve. And now I am going to start heating my pan. So because we're doing this for the class, I actually prepped a batter earlier this morning that's been resting in the fridge, just because I wanted to show you kind of how the batter should be. And what's interesting, so imagine we've put that in the fridge, fast forward 24 hours, we've taken it out. You can see that although I use the exact same measurements, this batter is much thicker than what went into the fridge. That's because the individual grains of the buckwheat flour really absorb the water and sort of puff up and get thicker. So it becomes just a little bit thicker. And that's why I gave you that range in the milk. We may need to add a little bit of milk. So if you remember what I said earlier, what are we looking for here to test the consistency? We're looking for it to be the exact sort of same consistency as heavy cream. So to me, this is looking a little bit thicker than a heavy cream. Maybe it's equivalent to Stratford Creamery heavy cream, but it's a little bit thick. So I'm going to add a little bit of milk. And if you're doing this for the first time, you might want to just try making one crepe first so you can see how the batter performs, so you have a reference point, and then maybe add the milk. But this looks a little bit better.
Someone says that the crepe class you taught last year led them to a semi-success trying their own, but those were the wheat flour, not buckwheat, and now they're buying a crepe pan.
Oh, that's great to hear. Yay. It will be so much easier with a crepe pan. There's just something about the design of the pan that I think makes it sort of just facilitates the whole process. But that's great to hear you've been making in the crepe.
Someone
Yeah.
from Arlington, Virginia, welcome. And then somebody asked, I'm noticing that you whisk rather gently rather than wildly like me. Any thoughts?
So there absolutely is a place for wild whisking, I would say. It just depends on what you're working with. Here, because I had already whisked my eggs, it really wasn't necessary to whisk too much more. Everything's fully incorporated. But if you're whisking up your egg whites into like a kind of a foam, or you absolutely will need to get some elbow grease in there. So that's great that you that you're whisking that strongly. I think just make sure you've got a good wide bowl with high sides, so that it won't go over the edges.
Is it possible to overbeat the batter like pancake batter?
Because there isn't a leavening agent in this, it's a much more forgiving batter. And also the buckwheat is just so hearty. I'd say it's hard to over whip this one.
And you're not developing any gluten because there's
exactly
gluten.
there's no gluten that you're developing, exactly. And I will even say, although I don't say this often, but the French chefs would probably turn over in their graves to hear it, but you could make this in a Vitamix or a blender. And that would be totally fine. Some things I don't advise doing that because, like you were saying, they could get over whipped. But yeah, if you're wanting to go quickly, you could just throw everything into the blender and it will be probably pretty close to the real thing. So there's always a place for shortcuts when we need them. So I've added a little ghee to the pan. I don't know if everyone can see the.
It's on screen.
Yeah,
you're good.
All right, great. So you want to heat it to about medium, till where you're really feeling the heat about this height. And it may take a couple of tries. I always say the first crepe will generally be a failure that then you get to eat. So it's not a bad thing. But yeah, don't be too concerned if the first one isn't perfect. So this is the key point to remember, and I wish we could be all in person so you could try it and I could kind of watch, but you want to take your non-dominant hand and hold your crepe pan above the heat source, so removing it from the heat source. At the same time, you're using your dominant hand to get a good spoonful of the batter, wiping it off so it doesn't drip, and then pouring it into the center of your pan. You're going to hear a sizzle if the pan's hot enough, and then very slowly turning it around. And this is the part that takes a bit of practice. You want to turn it slow enough so that the batter will fall into all of the sides of the pan. So oftentimes when I teach this class in person, I think the most common mistake is that people will kind of turn the pan quickly. And what happens is then, if you imagine, if you go back and forth quickly, it doesn't give the batter enough time to reach the edges. And so you'll have these sort of like legs coming out without reaching all the edges. So I almost like to think of it as going all the way to one side until the batter comes to that side, then going to, if say that's like 12 o'clock, then going to 3 o'clock, then to 6 o'clock, and then to 9 o'clock. So you're really thinking of it almost as the four corners of this rounded pan. And yeah, that's something that I think once you do even just once or twice, you'll see how easy it is. And so this is where we're going to give it a couple minutes on sort of low to medium heat. And what we're looking for is the edges to curl up a little bit. The original name for crepe comes from the Old French, crispe, which I believe comes from Latin, crispus, which means curly or sort of crispy on the sides or curled. And that really probably came about as the name because this was this really flat pancake with very crispy, curly sides. So that's what we're looking for at this point, is we're going to wait till the sides get a little bit crispy.
Someone asked, how do you know that the pan is hot enough? Will the drop of water test work or just the holding your hand?
So you could do the water test with a very small drop of water. I would just maybe get your hand wet, give it one shake, and then give it a second shake over the pan because you don't want to have a full droplet on the pan. But yeah, you want that to sizzle a little bit. I think it's really, I just think of it as sort of practice. You kind of want to be able to get your hand down that low and it's hot enough that you wouldn't go closer. So think of it like maybe a little lower than a pancake pan when you're making pancakes. But yeah, feel free to use a water test as well. Another thing that helps with those crispy edges is having a batter that is liquid enough, that's runny enough. If it's too thick, they're not going to curl. Okay, so I was being impatient here and rushing my pan. I turned it up a little too hot, and let me show you what happened. You see, I got some of these darker edges. Now, that's not the end of the world, but like I said, your first crepe is oftentimes your least pretty one.
Still gonna taste.
Yes, and I actually like those sort of extra dark spots. They get a nice and crispy. But if you're, serving company or presenting a crepe to people who care about these things, you want to aim to have kind of a uniform tan coloring, not having these splotches. Now, Carrie did even warn me right before we started that there's a hot spot on this pan. So you'll get to know your own, stovetop if you have hot spots or how your pan or stovetop perform.
Someone wants to know more about your wooden spatula.
Oh, yes. So these are really common in France. They're these called sort of wooden spatulas for crepes. And they usually come with a crepe pan. You can also order them separately. And if you're ever in France, it's the kind of thing that I used to always look for at like thrift shops or antique markets. And they're really like great because there are all of these antique ones. And we even had someone who took a class recently who said, I think he either got one from his grandmother or had gotten one in France, and it was really neat to hear he was actually using it. So yeah, they're super fun and really helpful. So let me show you the other side of this crepe. So our first side got a little browned there. The other side is slightly more uniform, and that's kind of what we're going for, maybe minus that dark spot. So my pan got quite warm, so you can see when it's steaming like this, you want to just give it a little bit of a rest. I'm taking it off of the heat, and I'm going to just give it a little bit more butter or ghee, clarified butter. This is sort of hard to describe, but you're not putting as much fat onto the pan as you would for pancakes, because again, the batter isn't needing to soak up as much fat, just enough to keep it from sticking, really. And if you do put too much, it's not a problem. You can just grab a paper towel and wipe some of it off. Okay, so right now, I'm not really comfortable getting closer than that. So that tells me that that's a pretty good heat. So again, sort of visualize as I'm doing this, imagine yourself making your crepes, because this is the part where it would be great to do together. But just you want to always start with your non-dominant hand holding the pan, and then you're going to be kind of maneuvering the batter with your dominant hand. So that's in my right hand. And taking the pan off of the heat, pouring it into the center. I'm hearing a little sizzle. That's a good sign. And then very slowly going around. There we go. When we do this class as a cook-along, it's really fun to see people show us their crepes at this point when they put them in the pan and sort of how they turn out. So yeah, be patient with yourself, because it usually will take one or two to get the hang of it. I'm going to be making two right now so that I can demo the different fillings. So while this is cooking, I wanted to start by just sort of talk you through some filling options. So the first option, which is the most kind of traditional, is to sprinkle on some Gruyere cheese. So Gruyere, although it is technically from Switzerland, it is the preferred cheese for most crêperies in France. You might also see Emmental or Comté, which are two other Alpine cheeses that are aged and have this really kind of nutty developed flavor. They also melt pretty well. They're not as aged as something like a Parmesan. And so they just, yeah, they melt beautifully and they still have that really kind of nice nutty flavor. So especially at certain times of the year, there are just really great Alpine cheeses that are, you know, made from the milk of like the spring pasture. And that's like really exciting to be able to find those to use.
Someone says they love all the cooking tips you're giving. Thank you.
Oh, good, good. Thanks. Yeah, and if anything isn't clear, just let me know, and I'll try to explain things a little more. So the first thing that you could do, if you were just planning to serve a simple buckwheat crepe with Gruyere, which is delicious by itself, is to grab another pan. And this is a really important step because you want to basically treat your crepe pan as designated only for batter. You don't want to ever have cheese or syrup or jam or anything that could be sticky on that pan. Why is that? It's because it's very easy to kind of muck up the bottom of that pan and get it so that your crepe is going to stick. You have to really treat it almost like we're in a kind of science lab here, and this cannot be cross-contaminated with anything else. So actually at home, I have 2 different crepe pans, so that what I do is when I'm taking this off of the pan, I want to put on my cheese and I want the crepe to still be hot. So what I'll do is I'll slide it into the second crepe pan on a second burner and then sprinkle on the cheese as it's still hot and still being heated on the bottom. And that will really help just give that cheese a good melt. Here it's going to melt a little bit, but ideally you're going to want to serve it extra hot and fully melted, so to have it on a burner. But I would never, ever, ever allow anybody to put cheese on my pan like this, because it will basically ruin your next crepe, because you will inevitably get cheese on your pan, or at least I would. So if you're very good at sprinkling, you could give it a try. But so let's see how we're doing here. This has gotten, I think, nicely browned. You see, it's a little bit better than the first one. We got some splotches, but this is okay. This is telling me that the pan is still a bit hot. And I think that this burner we're using, you know, this special burner for our TV streaming here, but it does have some hot spots. So that's why we're not seeing like this batter cooked as much. But probably on a gas stove, you're going to get a more uniform browning on that. So once we've got the cheese on the crepe, I'm just going to show you one way to plate it. So here in the States, we often roll our crepe, and that's like kind of something I've seen a lot in restaurants. But in France, it's more traditional to fold your crepe so that you're giving a little sample of what's inside. You're going to be able to see a little bit what's going to be served inside the crepe. And if this had been melted, it would stay fully. And then it's often served with a side salad. So that would be sort of your basic crepe on a menu. That would be maybe like €5 or something with a salad, and then you just have a little snack. Now, if you want to go a little bit kind of heavier and make it more of a main meal, that's where we can add more of the fillings. And something else that's pretty traditional is to melt your cheese, or you might want to put on the ham first, but a ham and cheese and egg crepe is super traditional. So what we might do, and I might actually, yeah, that's good. I'm going to grab another plate. So if I was going to be making a ham and cheese crepe, what I would probably do is add the ham now, and then sprinkle on the cheese and have the cheese melt while it's on my second skillet. And at the same time, I would take another pan, probably a stainless steel pan like this, put in some butter or some ghee, crack an egg, and let it cook just to the point where the white has become solid, so your yolk is still runny. And then I would slide that off and put it onto the ham, and then just fold the two sides. So you've got sort of this egg on ham and on cheese that you'd be able to serve as what's called a galette complète or cup complète. And that means sort of a full, like the full thing. So you've got your protein, your cheese, and the eggs and the egg. So that's delicious. And if you're, someone who eats meat, it's a really nice way to flavor the crepe. So I'm going to do just one more, and then we'll keep talking about fillings. I'd be curious to hear, what are folks' favorite fillings? Does anyone have something they especially like to make with a savory crepe?
I will let you know if anybody puts
Yeah,
them
feel
into the
free to
chat.
type it in. Has anyone had that crepe complète, the egg, ham, and cheese?
I have, but
Yeah.
only because you've done it in class before.
All right, right. And a little tip, you can just at City Market downstairs in the deli section, you can just ask them for like 1 or 2 slices of ham just to do this, and you don't have to get the full pack. So it's pretty quick. You can just use any deli ham will be great. Okay, so just something to watch for. You see these big bubbles down at the bottom here? That is an indication that my skillet is too hot. So if you're starting to pour your batter and seeing those, just turn it down a couple of degrees because it's going to be a little bit hot. It's nice to sort of learn what different things mean, so you'll be able to adjust. So while we're making this final crepe, I wanted to talk to you about the other possible fillings. So this time of year, it's really exciting to sort of think of all of the nice winter vegetables. And I thought, wouldn't it be fun to make a filling that uses that, like a roasted squash? I grew some butternut squash in my garden this year, and I love just roasting them. And this is also something I really like to tell people, because for many years of my life, I spent a lot of time, scraping off the skin, like peeling off the skin, then using a lot of effort to dice up a squash. And what I really like is that nature gave us this sort of perfect vegetable to be baked and processed as is. The skin serves as a wonderful insulator to be able to roast a squash without touching it at all, without really cutting into it. And that will kind of hold your liquid, hold the water inside, and almost like steam it from the inside out. It is important to give it a couple of punctures with a knife or a fork, just so that you don't have a squash explosion in your oven. But I love doing this, and this is my go-to way of making squash at home, because it's just super simple.
Someone says spinach and feta is good.
Oh, yeah.
Someone says something without ham, so maybe just like the egg and cheese, and also love mushroom crepes.
Oh, yes, yes. Mushroom is so good with
Someone
these.
asked if you would ever try onion, spinach, and ricotta. That sounds good.
Oh, that sounds really good. I'm a big fan of using ricotta. That could be really nice. Yeah.
Somebody says in the spring, I'll fill crepes with ham and cooked asparagus.
Yeah. Oh, nice.
Mushrooms and spinach again. A filling with liquor would be good.
Yep.
And then somebody asked, we have some overly ripe pears, ? I guess maybe they're asking for ideas.
Oh my gosh, pears are so good with the crepes. I would just throw those in the oven and bake them a little bit. They'll firm up, dry them out, and then put them onto the crepe, or even you could stew them in like a simple syrup. But pears would be delicious. Yeah.
Like a pear sauce.
Pear sauce.
Blend them down.
Totally. Yeah. So the first step is I'm going to make my filling, and this is super simple to do. And let's see, I might just going to do a little. All right. So if you haven't eaten a squash like this, I definitely recommend it. At home, what I will do is just like cut it open, steaming from the oven, just lather it with butter, put it on a little sea salt, and get a spoon and just kind of like go at it. It's so good. So for this, I'm going to scoop out the flesh. You can see how it's nice and soft. I baked this at 350 for about an hour and a half. It's not fussy. You can bake it really until it gets soft. And you want to avoid the seeds. We're not going to be pureeing the seeds. Although when I eat it myself, I will just eat the seeds because they're really good. And I think in the recipe, I say it calls for about 3 cups, but you can scale that down depending on the size of your squash and then just adjust the cream accordingly.
Somebody commented mushroom and cheese filling.
Oh, yeah.
And then somebody asks, can you talk about the difference between this kind of galette and the kind that is a rough pastry crust folded around a filling? Why are they both called galettes?
Yes, great question. Yeah. So galette is really a name for anything that is any baked good that is sort of flat and round. So you probably have seen there are galette cakes, there are galette pastries with fillings. There are lots of different galettes. So they're just used sort of interchangeably, but people will generally kind of know what you're talking about, especially if you're in Brittany, where you just have to kind of specify if it's a galette crepe or if you're in a creperie. But yeah, that's a great point that there are other kinds of galettes. So I'm going to these over here. So this part is super simple. We're just going to add a little bit of salt and then a little bit of cream just to give it a slightly more liquid texture. I'm going to put in a plug for the Butterworks Farm cream. They have really just probably the most delicious cream in this area. It's low temp pasteurized. They have Jersey cows, and their pasture is just really nutrient dense. I was up there a couple years ago to visit with Jack Laser, the former owner, and it's just they do a wonderful job of raising their cattle so that the milk is just so high in fat and really sweet. So it's a pleasure to be able to use this cream. It's not always available here, but when it is, buy it up.
I was just thinking when you talked about the cream-lined milk, you could get that, scoop the cream off, use the cream in this, and then use the milk for the.
You totally could.
But the Butterworks is amazing.
Yeah. No, if you wanted to save money, because this is quite expensive, I think it's like $6 or $7 for a little pint or half pint even. Yeah, totally. I would say get the non-homogenized milk, just keep off your cream and then use that. And that's a great idea, Gary. Yeah.
When we were talking about crepe fillings, I was thinking Thanksgiving leftovers.
Yeah.
Like chop up a bunch of turkey, mix it in some gravy.
So Carrie had this wonderful idea, which I fully support, to just any leftovers you've got lying around from Thanksgiving, just put those into the crepes. That would be great. Oh, I bet cranberry would go really nicely with buckwheat.
Oh, is the blender lid giving you trouble? I can come to it.
How do we do that? There we go. Okay.
And then I would just sort of hit any of those buttons. I know they have little symbols, but they're all to blend. I'm going to mute us while we're blending, so the sound will go away. Okay. Martha says, getting hungry.
Yes, me too.
Richard asks, is there anywhere you've had good authentic galettes in Vermont or nearby? If Skinny Pancake's not quite authentic.
That is a great question for those of us local. You know, I haven't had, other than private homes, I've not had a galette locally. I would say to just take a quick trip up to Montreal, and that's where you would find a really good buckwheat crepe. Any creperie that says it's specifically Breton, so from Brittany, is going to serve the authentic buckwheat crepes. And yeah, I was recently in Quebec City where they had just the most traditional crepes I've ever had outside of France. So yeah, what about you, Carrie? Have you had any locally that?
No, I've, Skinny Pancake, and they're really good, but
they're really good. Yeah. Although that was a great tip from someone, you could ask if maybe they could make a buckwheat crepe. Yeah.
Martha says spinach is great with cheese and garlic. Yeah, still getting some great filling ideas coming in.
Yeah.
It's a good way to serve vegetables to kids. It's more fun when it's wrapped in a pancake.
Oh my gosh, and smothered with cheese. Yeah. So we've got our filling, which I'm going to set aside for a moment, and we're going to turn to making the ragu. So anybody who's done French or Italian cuisine is probably used to a ragu as referring to a meat stew or a meat dish. Technically, it is a meat dish that has been highly seasoned. But more recently, I'd say in the last 20 years or so, we've sort of seen this transition to a ragu also encompassing vegetables. And especially mushrooms, I think because of their meatiness or similarity to meat. So this next recipe is for a kale and mushroom ragu, which originally, when I was planning this class, I was hoping to use wild mushrooms, but we're about a month behind for that. So I was wondering if anyone's in a warmer climate, it might be possible still for you to find some wild mushrooms. But it could be really fun if you, are a mushroom hunter to find some chanterelles or hen of the woods, anything. Yeah, we might have had those if this had been an October class. So that's why my burner isn't getting hot. I hadn't plugged it back in. All right. So I've prepped the ingredients, so I'm just going to go through what to use. So anytime you start a ragu, it's good to just start with a fat, preferably if you're in France, butter. And if you're in Italy, it might be olive oil. And then an allium. So that could be anything like a red or a white onion, a shallot, garlic, or leeks. So I personally love the combination of leeks with mushrooms and cheese in a buckwheat crepe. That's one of my sort of favorite flavor combos. And I just wanted to give a quick demo on working with leeks. So I've tried to grow leeks and have not really had good success getting that long white stem. Ideally, you're going to look for a leek in a store that has the longest bit of white on it. Don't take a shortcut and just chop up your leek, because the way that they grow, there is always going to be, no matter how much it didn't rain or how good of a farm it is, there is always going to be a fair amount of grit and dirt. So what you want to do, this is the way we were always made to cut leeks in school, is to cut it like this and then just hold it under the faucet with cold water and rinse out all of this sort of dirt. And it's really quick when you do it that way, much better than sort of holding it whole and peeling back each one individually, to just cut it like that. So I've already prepped my leek, but just wanted to show you that. And then we're going to take a little bit of, a fair amount of kale. This is green kale. You could use lacinato, would be nice. Really anything red Russian could be nice. And then we're going to use a little bit of sage as our flavoring. And I was really excited because my sage in the garden hasn't yet died, although we've had a couple of frosts.
It's some snow.
And some snow. It's holding on. So your sage might still be usable out there. It probably is. If not, we do carry here at City Market, the Red Wagon Herbs has started to do packaged herbs and has this beautiful sage. So that could be a good option. But we're going to get just enough to do a chiffonade. So you're going to kind of roll up your herbs into kind of a line, and then just go through and do a chiffonade. There's something just wonderful about the flavor of sage in a dish like this. And I think it's very, very typical. The French love their sage as they do their lavender and thyme and rosemary.
I was just thinking herb de Provence would probably be good in this.
Yes,
too, right?
herb de Provence would be lovely in this as well. Yeah, if you have that blend. All right, so I'm gonna have my sage ready to go. And then lastly, we have our mushrooms. So because I wasn't able to gather any mushrooms before the snow came, I went down to City Market, and we have, here I'm going to be using some shiitake, which I really like the flavor of. So this is the majority of these are shiitake. There are some oyster mushrooms. I think this is a yellow oyster, which is really pretty. It can add some color. It usually will retain its color. And then the more affordable cremini mushrooms are fine, the button mushrooms. So I always like to do a blend of mushrooms. It just makes it a little more interesting flavor-wise and kind of aesthetically as well. So once do we have a wooden spatula of some sort?
Wooden spoons in the right there for you.
And nothing with like a flat side.
No, just metal.
Yeah.
But I can get you a metal one if it will help.
That's okay. That's okay. This will be good. Thank you. So I'm going to start with our leeks.
Somebody asked what a chiffonade was, and it's what she did with the sage, cutting those really thin ribbons, rolling it.
Yeah, great question. So it literally means like a ribbon, and it's usually a term that's used for herbs or other greens when you basically want to see the like length of it in your dish. So you often will like roll it up, like this sage. I would roll it up kind of tightly like that, and then just do kind of very thin strokes. And you'll often see a chiffonade used as garnish. So to sprinkle that on top looks a little bit nicer. It's not as noticeable with the sage, but if you're working with other herbs, you'll kind of see, more of them. So feel free to add a little more butter based on the size of your leek. I feel like there's almost no such thing as too much butter when you're cooking mushrooms, because the mushrooms are just going to absorb that butter and give off their own juices. But they just love butter. So I've gotten into the habit of sort of seasoning things as I've added the first ingredient after the butter. I was cooking with an Iraqi friend, and she's basically converted me to that way of adding salt. And she says there's something about adding salt at that earlier stage that kind of develops the flavor. I think it just helps to kind of suck out the juices from the vegetables. So once those have turned sort of a translucid, you're going to then add our vegetables. Or actually, we could add the sage first and just give it a chance to be in contact with the fat, with the butter. If you've ever done, seasoning where you're cooking spices or herbs in like a ghee or like an olive oil as a seasoning method, you know that having something, an herb in the oil for a while or in the fat will really like permeate. It will sort of infuse the oil with a flavor. So that's often good to do early on so that it will have enough time to be fully infused. All right, so because my pan is pretty wide, I'm actually going to add even a little more butter.
The French would be so proud. More butter.
Yeah, we've got all these mushrooms. They definitely need a little more butter than is here on the pan.
I was just picturing green bean casserole in a crepe and wondering.
Ooh.
I think that would be a little weird.
Well, would it be a green bean casserole made with mushroom soup?
Yeah.
Because then that could work.
I'm just thinking Thanksgiving leftovers, that would be good.
Right.
Sweet potatoes.
Sweet potatoes would be great.
Yeah.
And that would be very similar to this dish. You could use sweet potatoes and either like sweeten them with something else and, maple syrup or brown sugar and cinnamon and go with the sweet route or keep them savory and add the cheeses and mushrooms. So to add all of our mushrooms, and with just one word of wisdom with mushrooms, they always cook down so much. So even though they might be like a little expensive at the store, I always try to kind of go easy on how many mushrooms I buy when I see that they're like $20 a pound. But then they cook down so much, I wish I had bought more. So it's always good to, I'd say, get a few more than you think you might need.
Same thing as like spinach. You get one of those boxes of spinach and you cook it and you have like a cup and you're,
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Yeah. All right. So I'm just going to let these go for a bit. And our kale is going to be the last thing, because all we need to do is really wilt that ever so slightly. So while these are cooking down, I'm going to prep my creme fraiche. The last step is that we're going to sort of season the vegetables with a little bit of cultured cream. If anyone isn't familiar, creme fraiche is sort of a French version of, I would say, almost like a sour cream, except that it's a little bit more of a refined and sophisticated flavor. It's basically cream that has been cultured. And so it's got that rich thickness of cream with that like a tanginess of yogurt, and it's just delicious. It's really great. I often will put that on desserts. It helps to counter the sweetness of like a pie or a tart that's pretty sweet. And it also can blend really nicely with savory herbs. And so what I've done here is prep some chives, which are going to give us a great bit of kind of chives garlicky flavor. And I'm going to add a good amount of the creme fraiche.
Creme fraiche is really good with sweet crepes too. Like I've done a strawberry and creme fraiche.
Oh my gosh, that would
really
be so good. I think creme fraiche really is kind of up there rivaling mascarpone for like the best fatty dairy product. Okay. So I've given you an indication of quantities in the recipe packet, but I'd say definitely follow those for the crepes themselves. However, for the vegetables, it can be really flexible, and feel free to alter those based on what you have on hand or what your family prefers. If you're not big mushroom fans, you could totally do this with just the leeks and the kale, the greens. So yeah, don't feel like you have to be sort of strict. If you really like the creme fraiche, you can add more of that.
Somebody here says, in a good spring, we get a dinner plate's worth of morels growing in their yard.
Oh, yeah, and that's exciting.
My boyfriend and I have found chanterelles growing in our backyard.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Wow. Those are the lucky folks. That's great. Yeah. Well, I would say that, next spring when you find those, definitely think of it as time to make crepes or galette. All right, so I'm going to let these cook down. You want to cook them really until the mushrooms are releasing their juices and have kind of shrunk a little bit. So we're going to keep going here. And while that's going, I'm going to do the next step, which is going to be to fill the crepe. Before I do, are there any questions on what we've covered so far?
Yeah, definitely take this time to take advantage of Anna's culinary knowledge, type those questions in, and I will ask out any that come through. None yet.
None yet. Okay, great.
Maybe people are typing furiously.
Yeah. So the last thing, which I forgot to mention, that we're going to season this ragu with is a little bit of fresh lemon. So I'd say grab an organic lemon because we're going to be using the skin, and a microplane grater. That's really great to make it nice and fine, and just grate some lemon. And that's going to give it this really sort of fresh, vibrant, citric flavor that I think will go really nicely with the creme fraiche and with the sage also.
Yeah, you can really see how much those mushrooms have cooked down already. Just
you can see why. I think I put 2 pounds of mushrooms on your recipe packet, and at $20 a pound, that could be a pricey meal, but it really is worth it. Or feel free to have them or put in just as much as you might use. Okay. So while we're waiting for the mushrooms to cook a little bit longer, I'm going to prep our 2 crepes. So this part is really straightforward and fun.
Martha asks, how about using olive oil instead of butter?
Yes, you could absolutely do that. And often if I'm, making this type of dish at home, what I'll do is put a little bit of butter for the flavoring and the rest olive oil. That would be sort of probably healthier. Yeah.
Somebody here asks, if you're making the galettes with a sweet filling, would you sweeten the batter at all?
Oh, great question. Yeah, so I do teach a crepe class actually on the sweet crepes, and I'm doing that one again in February. And you will see with that recipe, yeah, there is, I think it's maybe like 40 grams of sugar. It's just a little bit, a couple tablespoons. Or you can make it not sweet and just have the sweetness be in your filling. But I think a lot of places do sweeten that. Yeah, that batter.
Suggestions for keeping them warm while cooking and waiting to fill them.
Yeah, so that's one of the challenges with crepes is that I tend to never actually serve them as part of a dinner party for more than 4 people because they are just time consuming and it's sort of hard to keep them warm. That said, I don't mind letting them get cool like this because what I would do is just throw them into the oven right before service and just have them kind of warm right back up. And that also will help sort of crisp the sides. So earlier I mentioned how here in the States, we often roll our crepes and how it's more traditional in France to have them either folded together or halved. And I'm now going to say this recipe is an exception to that because I actually like having them rolled up. So we're going to roll them sort of loosely. And this is why you don't want to have your crepes overly done because they will kind of get too crispy and will be hard to roll. And then we're just going to cut them in half. On the bias so you can sort of get a peek inside. And I'm going to have them all ready to go for my plate. All right, so this is getting very close. I'm going to throw on the kale. And at this stage, you could add just a little bit of water or cover it with a lid, and the steam will help to cook down the kale. Because the creme fraiche is cultured, like yogurt, I tend to not like to heat it too much because it will sort of destroy that bacteria that's good. But if it's a little bit warm, that's no problem. So I'm going to wait and add the cream at the very end, the creme fraiche. So feel free to cook it down as much as you like your kale cooked. I'm going to give it just another minute. So while that's cooking, I'll just take a moment to show you the salad and the salad dressing, because in France, you can never have a galette without a little side of salad. And this is going to continue to cook. So I'm just going to take it off the heat at this point. Or just cut the heat. All right, so who all has made a vinaigrette before? Probably a lot of you have. It's a very straightforward recipe, and it's just really great to be able to know how to do quickly. So the first step is to use the bowl that you're going to serve your salad in if you're not going to plate the salad. That just saves us one less dish to have to clean up. I like to use a Dijon mustard made by this wonderful sort of multi-generational family that has been making mustards in the Dijon region of France for a long time. And it's called Edmond Fayot, the Fayot family. And this has recently actually become available here in Burlington at City Market. The downtown store carries this now. I don't know if our South End store
I haven't looked specifically.
Yeah, but otherwise Daedalus carries it, and it's this wonderful, really flavorful mustard from Dijon. So we're gonna add a little mustard, and then Fayot also makes a vinegar, or a white vinegar and and a cider vinegar. This, I just have the cider vinegar, and I prefer to use the white wine vinegar for this recipe. So I'm going to use this, but if you're, next time you're in Montreal or in France, you can look for the Edward Fayot white wine vinegar. And we're just going to add a little bit. And we're going to whisk these together. This is where the wild whisker could go at it. This is totally fine to whisk. No chance of over whisking. Mustard is a wonderful product to use in the kitchen because it is an emulsifier. It will have this amazing function of being able to bring vinegar and oil together and emulsify them. So even just a tiny bit of mustard will go a long way to be able to do that.
Somebody asked if you could hold the mustard up to the camera closer and show the brand.
Absolutely, yeah. So it's called Edward Fayot, and I think I put that in your handout, the name, if you want to.
Oh, the last part.
So it's Edmond, and then F-A-L-L-O-T, Fayot. Yeah, and they have a whole line of vinegars as well. And then we're going to add our herbs. So this is what's really special about French vinaigrettes, especially during the growing season, is that you'll often have wonderful things like fresh tarragon or fresh chives or shallots or scallions in your dressing. And so I've just minced some tarragon here, which is wonderful, and just it's so typically French that as soon as you smell it or taste it in something, it just sort of brings you back to any French meal. That's something that I always enjoyed having in France. And then some chives, and then some scallions. Now you could wait and add these at the end. I sort of like the process of mixing them in as I'm emulsifying, especially if I'm serving the dressing right away and it's not going to have time to sit overnight and kind of infuse the vinegar. I think that extra bit of sort of rubbing and sort of bruising is actually helpful. So this is the point where we're going to add very, very gently, very slowly, the olive oil. And whisking the whole time, you should be able to just create a vinaigrette that's not going to separate very easily or quickly. I would go with a kind of a middle ground oil in terms of flavor, not something like super strong for this, because you want the mustard is going to be kind of your shining star. But something that does have a bit of a fresh flavor. Okay, so I've probably made enough dressing here for a little more salad than Carrie and I are going to eat tonight.
Leftovers.
Yeah, and it's always great to have a dressing. I like to make it in bulk so that I'm not having to do this. It's a simple process, but still it's nice to just not have to do it every time you want to eat salad. So what I'm going to do is just put a little bit of this into, I would usually use like a small glass mason jar at home, and then just have that on the countertop for tomorrow when I want a salad. And by then it will be infused a little bit more. And then you can just add a little bit of salt. And so for our greens, I thought it might be nice to do an arugula salad tonight. Arugula is something that is still growing. My brother has a farm in Maine, and I believe that he has arugula in his soup houses. And it's something that is just so kind of sweet as well as bitter, and I think goes really nicely with the buckwheat flavor. So we're just going to toss a little arugula in here. I always like it when someone dresses the salad for me. I know it's sort of common nowadays to have your dressing on the side, which for practical purposes makes a lot of sense. But I feel like it's just a nice step when someone has prepared the salad completely and it's ready to go. So you like salad, Carrie, right?
I do.
Yeah. Okay.
I'll do a
Great.
big salad.
So we're gonna dress a good amount. I wish you could all be here to sample this at the end.
Yeah, do the giant bowl that we have in the cabinet.
I know. Yeah. Okay, so this is good to sort of prep all of our different components so that they're all ready. I'm just going to finish off our mushroom ragu with the creme fraiche. Yeah, this looks so good. I always just love the way this looks. Makes you want to eat it directly
Straight out of
the pan. Yeah. So this is where it's great to just sample what you're making and make any final adjustments with your seasoning. So let's see if we need any more salt. So that tells me I forgot to add one ingredient, which is the lemon, because it really is nice to have this sort of final sort of flavor of, yeah, it's like you bite into it and then get that lemon afterwards. I'm gonna add a little more salt. And it's still warm. It's good for the lemon to be added when it's still warm and gonna infuse a little bit.
Would you add black pepper to this, or is this not
So
something
I didn't, but you totally could. You could, yeah, grind some black pepper in. You could even use white pepper. That I'd say that would be pretty traditional for something like this. The French like their white pepper.
So we have about 5 minutes left in our class time, so we're going to do the plating and seal that at the end. But now is the perfect time to be typing any last questions in.
Yeah.
Make sure that they get answered and you don't leave with unanswered questions as we do the final stages.
So, as you think about plating, it's always good to think of a plate that, you know, does justice to your dish. I thought it might be fun because of the shape of the crepes, the kind of long, like rolling them up like this, having them long. It might be nice to have sort of a non-traditional plate, not the round plate. And we can sort of stack them on each other. Let's see, if I were serving this for one person, I'd probably just have the two, might stack it like this. But with both Carrie and me, I'm gonna make sort of two of them. And then let's put the ragu on top. Kind of, you can be a little bit messy and spontaneous and just kind of drape it over. And it's always nice to put a little bit of chives. Let's see, my chives go. The French like to garnish with chives and will often put either whole or sort of halved chives on the plate.
Somebody asked if the mustard is sweet or hot.
Oh, it's more of a sweet mustard, but it does have a good bite to it still. But yeah, it hasn't been
not spicy.
It's not spicy. It hasn't had any of the red pepper added. And then we'll just put our salad on the side here. And our last step would be to wipe up any drips or splatters. But there we go. So voila is your galette plate with the ragu, mushroom ragu, and the squash puree filling.
Could you do the foldy thing if you didn't want to scatter on top?
Okay. Yeah, you absolutely could. Feel free to play around with it. You could, you know, put a good amount. If you're not rolling it, you could be a little bit more liberal with the amount of squash. And then just put the sides in, fold the sides in, and you could put this on the side, or you could put it on top of the squash. Maybe just like a little bit of almost like a garnish down the center could be nice, but always the salad next to it. So yeah, that's in a nutshell how to do the buckwheat galette. Does anyone have any final questions I could answer?
There's no questions. A bunch of people just saying thank you so much, learned a ton.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Good. Well, please feel free to reach out. I think I gave you my email on the recipe sheet, so I'd be happy to, answer questions as you're actually making the crepes. But yeah, I would definitely say it's worth investing in a crepe pan if you want to be doing this on a regular basis. But definitely try the buckwheat flour. It's really flavorful. I wish we could just hand you one of these crepes to see. But yeah, best wishes with your crepe making. Good luck.
All right. Yep. Thank you everybody so much for tuning in and joining us. We're really excited to be able to offer these live stream classes, although we do hope to get back to in person at some point. I will send a survey link out tomorrow, and I'll include Anna's email in that just in case it wasn't in the handout. So you can always email me or email her. And again, we'd love to see photos. If you do make these, send us a picture. But otherwise, I will send us off for the evening. Oh.
Yes, and I'll just mention February 2nd is International Crepe Day, and I will be teaching a class. That's the next class I'll be teaching on sweet crepes. So we'll talk about all the fillings and a little bit more of the tradition of why everyone in France makes crepes on that day.
Yes.
If you want to tune in.
That will be exciting. I love the sweet crepes too. Someone says, looks delicious, dairy-free. This version is not dairy-free because we added the creme fraiche and butter and all that, but I'm sure we've talked about you could make some dairy-free substitutes.
Yes, absolutely. And for the filling, you could make this without the cream. You could just put the squash, like seasoned squash. You could just make the vegetables without the cream, and that would be delicious too. You could put in tofu. Yeah, so lots of flexibility with it. Yeah.
Great. All right, everybody. I don't see any other questions. Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and end the event, and hopefully we'll see you at another class soon. Thank you.
Good night.